on stage.
Can I also request Bodhisattva Ganguly, the executive editor of the Economic Times, to please join him.
Do you want to speak first? Oh, yeah, I think you should just speak for about 10 minutes, then we can wait. Or you can do it from here only. Do it from here only.
Sir, could we please request you first to make your address?
Please speak from here.
Thank you very much, Economic Times, for this invitation to participate in this discussion at the Global Business Summit. Though I regret that I couldn't attend the Prime Minister's session yesterday, but I watched it very closely from my office where I was working last evening. And I'll try and keep away from many of the issues that the Honorable Prime Minister has referred to yesterday. Another 3 months from now, we complete 4 years in government. And there is a sense of satisfaction, at least that I have, that the last 4 years have seen India, despite many global adversities, being one of the faster growing economies, if not the fastest. At the same time, it's been possible to blend political prudence with economic reforms. It's been possible to keep both the direction and the pace of economic reforms going. And I think an agenda for the future has been laid down, where Indian public opinion is not merely aspirational, but also very impatient. And therefore, all governments, center, state, future governments, will all now have to act and deliver in accordance with that aspiration. I think the direction, and these are, when we speak in terms of New India, the few basic points that I would like to flag, and then leave it to Mr. Ganguly to take the discussion forward. The first, of course, being that the object of the entire exercise has been, both for domestic and international investors, to make India one of the better avenues for investment. And I think that's a destination which we seems to have established. If at all, it can now further improve from now onwards. The second, I think we should now stop repeating the phrase ease of doing business. We've not only moved up, but with the kind of micro reforms which now are in the process of being planned, I think over the next 2 to 3 years, from position number 142 to 100, I think the target of 50 is fairly achievable. And that's something which government departments have identified, right up to the micro level of the reforms as per the World Bank requirement, and we'll probably get it. And therefore, merely now repeating it won't help us, because ease of doing business was a governmental responsibility. And I can assure you that that responsibility is being fairly well acquitted. And I think we have to transform from there, from ease of doing business, which was a government responsibility, to an industry responsibility, which is the habit of doing ethical business. And in the habit of doing ethical business, I think, there is a section of the Indian industry which still has a significant distance to cover. And it is here that Indian industry itself needs to introspect. Governments in this area have done a fair bit in the last few years. All areas of governmental discretion now have been virtually eliminated. They've been substituted by a more objective criteria. So you no longer have controversies of allocations of resources based on discretion or allocations of contracts based on discretions. The governmental systems are now increasingly making it more objective. Political corruption in New Delhi radically brought down, if not disappearing. That's an important step forward. I had last year taken an important step, and next week onwards it's going to be implemented, a system of cleansing political funding, which was an important contributor to this whole practice of unethical businesses and the business-political party relationship. And therefore, funding through electoral bonds can now be through officially declared money, rather than the invisible process which went on into this country. And just as I mentioned that we eliminated discretions in matters of contracts, resources, I think this whole sea change which is taking place, which is undergoing in this creditor-lender-borrower relationship, because that old concept that monies once borrowed may or may not be returned, that unethical practice which existed in India, I think it's something which had to come to an end. And today we are seeing a large significant change taking place, and the process that follows it now has to be extremely transparent and objective. And I'm quite glad at the fact that the initial experience of the IBC itself, with the government maintaining an arm's length distance, and the entire process which has been worked out under a quasi-judicial supervision, itself is proving to be reasonably transparent and objective itself. And therefore, governments having done their little bit, I think we must now stop using ease of doing business. That's something which can be well achieved in India. The Indian businesses have to realize that it has to be the habit of doing ethical business, which is something which now I think needs to be introduced. And those who deviate from that course must always remember that the consequences will not only be a commercial and a civil death as far as their businesses are concerned, but the law would be tightened further if necessary in order to find out where they are and what is the extreme action that law permits against such delinquent persons itself. The third important factor, I think, in New India is the fact that compliances have to improve and have improved a little to some extent. So the use of technology, digitization itself as an important instrument of governance, and in which compliances, including tax compliances themselves, have significantly moved up. I can see that happening in direct taxes, and the very fact that even in indirect taxes we've been able to add in the last 1 year at 50% more assessees by just the transformation of the system itself, I think is extremely significant. The next important aspect is that cooperative federalism now has to be used as an increasing tool in governance. I am personally more than satisfied with the first federal institution in India which has functioned, the GST Council. That has a statutory mandate behind this, and it's functioned well. And therefore, I think even without a statutory mandate, areas like power, agriculture, social sector schemes, I think these are areas, the health scheme for instance, where similar institutions, even maybe on a non-statutory basis, have to be experimented in India, because cooperative federalism in these areas really will be in much larger public interest itself. The next point I wish to flag is that even though using technologies we have reduced subsidies which went to those who didn't deserve the subsidies, and there has been in a large number of schemes the direct benefit scheme, the additional resources which the governments are able to gather as a part of the poverty removal or the poverty alleviation program also is resulting now in increased supply of essential goods and services as far as the weaker sections is concerned. It was initially food, or it was the Manrega salaries. And today, if we see, it's being extended to rural housing, toilets, Ujjwala, the gas connections, the social insurance, and now the health care. And therefore, these essential goods and services from the increased resource of the state as a part of the poverty alleviation program, I think these are important steps which have moved forward. Infrastructure creation in many areas has gained a lot of speed, and I think that accelerated speed has to be maintained. Our rural roads, our highways, ports, aviation, airways, airlines, these are already turning out to be good success stories to narrate. And I think railways has to be the next big change which has been to be optically visible itself. And therefore, once this pace itself is maintained, and besides railways, I always believe that with increased urbanization, the quality of urban revival, urban renewal, I think is extremely important. I can already spot about 20-odd cities in the country of a reasonably large size where urban infrastructure is substantially improved to global standards. And I think this number has to now very largely increase beyond that point. And of course, the last point in this category that I wanted to say as a part of the opening comments itself, special care, and this is again an area where the center-state cooperation would be required, will have to be education and health care. Whatever we are able to invest will still be lower than what the system itself needs, and therefore over the next decade or two, for that creation of that new India, I think this is one area where investment would be absolutely essential from the increased resources of the state which are going to come about. Thank you.
So thank you, sir, for these wide-ranging comments. I think it sort of dwelt on many areas affecting the economy and indeed beyond. In fact, my first question actually was on this, the ethics issue. I think in one of your earlier comments, you talked about the lack of ethical practices in a section of the business community. Of course, you've referred to it. If I can ask you, how widespread do you think the problem is? Is it a remnant of the license permit, Raj, which is still lingering over, or is this something which is much more widespread?
Well, I think when I speak in terms of the ethical practices, I think it's a significant problem in India. And I'd be too glad that rather than always have a close look at what governments are doing, Indian businesses and industries looked inward. And this is a wide range. after all, this was the Indian model that you create the shell companies
Right.
and round trip monies through them. This was a standard operating procedure that any practicing chartered accountant would advise you, and this has gone on for decades.
Right.
Now, if you claim to be the fastest growing global economy and aspire to move into being a developed economy, now where is the place for practices of this kind in the world of business? Then are the investors, when they look at government policy, are they going to look at their Indian partners and Indian competitors also with these kind of practices? This whole business of NPAs, how much of it is due to business failures,
Right.
and how much, some part of it in some companies may also be due to the fact that diversions may have taken place.
Right.
Cases where of willful default are something which is much more than merely a business failure itself. The bank frauds which are now come to surface. Now, if you periodically have incidents of this kind, I think the entire effort of ease of doing business itself goes into the background, and therefore it is these cards on the economy which take the front seat.
When you say ease of doing business going into the background, would you, are you referring to the fact that these kind of episodes might call for more regulation? Is that an issue that you see here?
You see, I think they call for every person in position with whatever responsibility to undertake to perform his job, and where regulation is lacking,
Right.
if it needs to be strengthened, it needs to be strengthened. You see, ultimately, if a fraud is taking place in multiple branches of banking system, and you don't have a single employee who raises the red flag, doesn't that become worrisome for the country as a whole?
Sure.
And similarly, if you had the top managements who were indifferent to what was going on, or either unaware of what was going on, you had at least multiple layers of auditing system
Right.
which chose to either look the other way or did a casual job. And you had an inadequate supervision right on top from the supervisory agencies itself.
Right.
And therefore, I think who did what will eventually be found out only in the course of whatever inquiries are on. But it does create a worrisome situation.
And is there scope for introspection, or is there need for introspection on the part of regulators also? I mean, you referred to it briefly. Because
You see, we must always remember that regulators have a very important function. Regulators ultimately decide the rules of the game.
Right.
And the regulators have to have a third eye which is perpetually to be open,
Right.
and which must keep looking at the sector. But unfortunately, in the Indian system, we politicians are accountable, the regulators are not.
Right. I'll just come to another question. I think electoral bonds, you say, is going to be launched soon, and this is something with which you have been personally associated with. You have advocated it. Would you like to address one of the criticisms, which is the anonymity point in terms of electoral bonds?
Well, I'll tell you, there is 100% anonymity in the present system. Who gave a donation, nobody knows. How did he create the money, nobody knows. Who did he give it to, nobody knows. How was it spent, nobody knows. The critics of the electoral bond system are those who want the present system of 100% anonymity coupled with unclean money to continue. So let us be first clear, the present system is total anonymity and unclean money. The electoral bond system is that you buy the bond from the State Bank of India only through a banking instrument, so it's clean money. Your balance sheet will reflect how many bonds you have bought. The political party's balance sheet will reflect, and its returns will reflect, what is the sum total of the bonds that it has got. So the entire money in the hands of a political party, so in the hands of the donor and the donee, will be clean money. So the 100% unclean money is replaced by 100% clean money. That's the first change. The second change is that there is a substantial improvement in transparency. We'll all know how much a political party has received. The company's or the individual's balance sheet will also declare as to how much he has bought. How he has distributed it is the only limited anonymity. So the critics, and mind you, these are critics who have a problem with every solution. These critics want 100% unclean money and 100% anonymity to continue. But if there is 100% clean money with substantial transparency, is something that they have a serious objection to. So the effect of which is the bonds must go out and the present status quo with which they are very comfortable must continue.
So if I can refer to, you refer to lack of accountability of regulators and the government's sustained attempts to improve ease of doing business. Now, one aspect which has made doing business somewhat difficult are, without our decisions by the judiciary. For example, there have been at different points in time widespread bans imposed on large parts of the country on mining. What type of passenger vehicles can be sold. What are your thoughts on this issue? Is there also an accountability issue vis-a-vis politicians which you referred to?
Well, I don't think I am the best suited to answer that question today. But I do hope some legal scholars who also understand the impact of the judicialization of the economy at least undertake this as a research subject. And in case of some of the judgments, what is the negative impact of India's GDP at the end of the year, and how many were the job losses caused on account of those judgments? I do hope some legal scholar initiates a debate so that even as a part of a self-improvement exercise, the institution concerned itself undertakes a study of this.
So coming to another issue which you addressed, the health scheme, which is obviously very much, there's a lot of public interest in the health scheme. You referred to the possibility of some kind of a federal structure between. Could you elaborate a little more than that? Because as you said, the GST Council has worked very well. What exactly do you have in mind?
You see, the GST Council model is statutory. It's prescribed by the Constitution. That you have all the finance ministers of every state of the central government. You have officials assisting them. They collectively take all a decision, and therefore we are able to bring about a consensus. At the end of the day, even if political parties and spokesmen and their leaders outside take a particular position, the ministers within the council at least are able to work out and thrash out a reasonable consensus, because that's really required for governance. I think in areas like agriculture, in areas, the health scheme that you mentioned, the social sector schemes, and let us say we give pensions to economically deprived people. Now, in each of these schemes, the pooling in of the resource of the center and the state, and how do you best utilize that resource so that there is no duplication and one can top the other, and therefore come out with something which is extremely cogent as far as the state is concerned. And I don't think there would be a single state which will say that I want a health insurance for the economically weaker section in my state for a lesser amount than my neighboring state. So everybody would want the same amount, and therefore, depending on the resources of a state, the fact that they are able to collaborate with each other and add to the resource of each other, I think is an area on which arrangement between the center and the state could be possible. The Niti Aayog is an ideal institution which can actually coordinate this.
So one more area which you didn't in fact refer to in your speech is disinvestment. While disinvestment, obviously your take from disinvestment in the last fiscal was more than the target, and this year also there is a decent target. But these have mostly been sales to the stock market, either through the ETF route or sales of 5% and so on in many of the profit-making PSUs. What hasn't happened so far, although some are other strategic divestments which were a feature of...
You see, last year the Niti Aayog did prepare a list of a number of such companies which are meant for strategic disinvestment. And I think that's the schedule is there. Air India, of course, is the big one, which is progressing and seems to be progressing quite well.
Okay. If I could ask you another question on something which the Prime Minister referred to last year, and this goes back to the first couple of questions on the ethics issue. He in fact referred to the shrinkage of exports in the first couple of years and said this could possibly be due to over-invoicing. He didn't say that it was the reason, but it could be one of the reasons. Is that something, do you have any thoughts on this subject, and whether, what is your take? Of course, exports have now started reviving.
You see, it could be. There could be multiple factors in areas. But to my mind, two of the other reasons was, one was, of course, the fact that the global economy wasn't doing well.
Sure.
And if your buyers across the world have less money to spend, obviously they'll buy less. And therefore, global trade itself, world over, had suffered. And secondly, in this shrinkage of exports, also remember the fact that the oil prices dropped had a very important role.
Right.
And therefore, a very large amount of crude comes into the country, gets refined and goes out. And therefore, if the crude prices fall, in volume terms, the trade may be the same, but in dollar terms, the quantum of both imports and exports itself would optically be lesser, because the crude price itself had fallen. So the refined oil which was going back was costing much less. The crude which came into the country was costing much less. And therefore, these two factors also did contribute to what we call as the shrinkage itself. So if the crude prices skyrocketed again, you will at least, I hope that doesn't happen, but at least that won't mean that the international trade has gone up. The volume would still be the same, but the quantum would have gone up.
We'll in fact take a couple of questions from the audience, but just before that, I just wanted to ask you two other questions. One is on the corporate tax rate. I know you've explained it. The target of 25% has been done for obviously the smaller companies, but I think some of the larger companies, many of whom are represented in this room, would still look forward to, when it will happen for them. So any sort of timeline you could...
I had clearly said that I will couple it with the phasing out of the exemptions.
Right.
Now, once it comes to phasing out of the exemptions, each exemption has a sunset date. And therefore, if we advance that sunset date, we'd be actually guilty of doing something retrospective, because a large number of companies would have planned their businesses according to the sunset date itself. And therefore, I haven't tinkered with any sunset date. So within the limits of the affordability of the budget, I started moving up from the manufacturing companies in the first instance, and then went up to 50 crores, and this time I went up to 250 crores. So today you have, out of the 700,000 companies, you have 99% of the companies in India which have come into this 25% bracket, there are 7,000 companies above this. And
Which are the largest companies?
which are the large companies, which are the high tax paying companies.
yeah.
But I don't think those and that probably, I had linked it with the phasing out of the exemptions.
And the actual tax they are paying could well be lower.
The actual tax they are paying is about 22 or 23%. So I don't think these 7,000 in a hurry for 25% themselves, with the exemptions gone, because they'll all end up eventually paying 2% more.
Okay. A couple of political questions. The Prime Minister again referred to the need for simultaneous elections, or at least a debate on how this could. What are your thoughts on this issue?
You see, I think this was the original intention, that we must have the elections are always planned simultaneously.
But originally, you mean when at the start of the Constitution?
As a start, but then because of Article 356 or
Right.
early dissolutions of state assemblies, and you've had one earlier, you had two aberrations in the Lok Sabha, I think people may have forgotten.
Yeah.
The 1971 election was called in the fourth year.
Yeah.
And for the 77 election, Mrs. Gandhi extended a 5-year term of parliament by changing the constitution to 6 years. She actually initially did it for 7 years and then made it 6 years. So that whole timetable got altered itself. And today, frankly speaking, both from expenditure and from governance point of view, to have 2 or 3 elections every year is a serious challenge. Every time you want to take a policy decision, you are constrained by the fact what will be the impact on elections, and you have to think of the political consequences and so on. At least if elections are held once in 5 years, India will see 4.5 years of comfortable governance in the center and the state, and policy formulation besides lesser expenditure.
Right.
So I think a simultaneous election overall for the country is a much better situation.
But I think there's widespread agreement here. But even if you were to do it, let's say you somehow you come back to power in 2024, you reach that. But again, you could go out of kilter. I mean, some assembly could fall somewhere, right? So.
You see, there was, I remember once a suggestion made that you must have a fixed tenure of 5 years.
Right.
And if within that fixed tenure a government falls, then the alternative government must be in place for the residuary term.
Right.
You don't advance
So
elections.
you don't allow the assembly to be dissolved, essentially. One more political question. I think 2019 is in everyone's mind. The BJP obviously won a majority in the last elections. Now, it could be argued that however good the performance of the government may have been, in many states it had won, I mean, you know the numbers, 73 out of 80 in UP, all the seats in Gujarat, all the seats in Rajasthan, 38 out of 40 in Madhya Pradesh. So, is it not, regardless of even if there is widespread support for PM Modi, the sheer electoral arithmetic would dictate that number of seats could come down because you're already at the maximum in many states in northern and western India. So how does that equation work out? Where do you?
Well, today I'll only tell you the analysis and the arithmetic that you make in Delhi has very little relationship with what's happening in the rest of the country.
Lutyens Delhi.
In 2014, we started by being told that you'll probably end up getting 150 seats. And then when things looks better, some people went up to 180. When after the polling, nobody still was willing to give us more than 220.
Sure.
That's the outer limit people gave us. But I can only tell you this, people in India are wiser than the analysts of New Delhi. And therefore, the kind of anarchic combinations which are perceived is something I don't think India can afford. India certainly deserves better than that.
Thank you. I'll just ask for one or two. I'll just come to. Okay, there are many. Maybe shall we go with Janmajay first, if that's.
Sir, do you think the time has come to have a look at public sector banking? I mean, in terms of maybe going to the 30% ownership and, think HR economy and some government economy. I mean, like an Axis Bank would have been a perfect public sector.
Privatization question.
I'm not talking privatization. I'm just saying reduce.
Sure.
You see, all I can say is that a lot of people have started expressing this view, but this involves, I think, a very large political consensus, because this will also involve an amendment to the law and
The Bank Nationalization Act.
the act itself. And my impression is that Indian political opinion in Parliament still may be behind or may not find favor with this idea itself.
But
In fact, I think I saw some ripples of a positive debate, because when I brought in the proposal for the recapitalization by inducting 2,12,000 crores, it was welcomed as a decision. But when Parliament was discussing it, so at the end of the day, somebody raised this issue, and then the moral hazard of banks losing money to a private sector individuals and the taxpayer paying for it. I think for the first time this is something that struck the MPs in the itself, and that morally this is there's no alternative, but it's a very challenging decision for us. This impression went through Parliament.
Mr. Kapoor. Can someone get him a mic, please, Mr. Rana Kapoor? This side. This side, this side, this way. Here.
Good morning, sir. My question is, all over the world, central banks, whether it's a 22 trillion economy in America, whether it's 11 trillion economy in China, we are aspiring to be 5 trillion by 2025, and hopefully, and all goes well, 10 trillion by 2030. The question is that our mandate to our regulator, as in Reserve Bank of India, is only inflation targeting. Everywhere in the world, the central banks start by giving you growth statistics. How many jobs have been created? How many housing starts have happened? How many automobile sales have happened? And so on and so forth. So growth is always the agenda number one, and inflation targeting is agenda number two. So how, sir, can we mandate in an advancing economy, which is aspiring, as we discussed yesterday and all of today, to be a 10 trillion economy? How can we aspire?
I think that's not fair to the central bank to say that when they take a decision, they don't keep other objectives in mind. I think over the years, central bank, particularly in India, also has matured. And when I go through their minutes and details of at least the briefings that I get, I think they take a fairly comprehensive view. But we are open to our own views on appreciating or not appreciating what they decide. But I don't think they disregard the requirement of growth. That would be a little unfair to the central bank to say that.
Okay. This gentleman there, yeah. If you can get a mic to him.
Sir, this is, I'm Sanjay Kedia from Marsh. The question is, so there's so much has been done in the last 4 years, whether it's GST, demonetization, on subsidy, bankruptcy code. If you were to look back and say, of all these various things done, which are the top ones from your perspective for the benefit of the country in terms of economic growth? And if you were to reflect back, which ones you would say government should not have done it or could have done it differently or executed better?
You see, there are, I think each one of them was important. For instance, I think there are some which bring early harvest. For instance, opening out the economy brought in early gains in the sense that we got a lot of FDI and India became a good destination. Our whole emphasis on infrastructure makes growth more visible. But demonetization itself will, in the medium term and in the long term, move us towards greater digitization, move a little away from cash economy. I think the benefits of GST have only been partly achieved so far in terms of the posts getting away and a free flow of goods and movements taking place. We are trying to ease in the compliance system. And once we are able to put in the anti-evasion measures in place, I think there'll be a huge boost as far as revenues are concerned. The IBC itself, I think, is changing a lot about as far as the ethics issue that we were just discussing. I think each one of them has its own place, but then there are, after the event you realize, people come up with suggestions. For instance, somebody gave me a suggestion that I had come with the income disclosure scheme prior to demonetization. Now, some people felt that you should have done that simultaneously. Now, what is the effect of that, I really can't say, but these are all suggestions which come, and I'm quite open to listening to most of them.
I'll just ask you a question on the IBC. One of the much discussed issues is the change you brought in by way of an amendment that the existing owners can't bid. I mean, there's been a lot of debate and discussion on that issue. What was the logic behind that change?
You see, I think the process ought to have credibility. If credibility had disappeared in the IBC process, and public opinion, political opinion would not have attracted it, it would have looked like a scam. And if the same people who've run down these companies to the ground come and reacquire them at a fraction of the cost, nothing changes except banks taking a haircut. Now, this may be accepted in certain parts of the world, but I have not the least doubt it would never be accepted in India. And this would have come in for widespread criticism, and therefore it needed to be changed.
Good morning, sir. My name is Tirthankar Goyal. I was working with the French government selling the French reactors to India. So I'm bringing this European investment to India. So just to give a feedback, 6,000 kilometers from here, because I'm spending my time between Paris and New Delhi, 9 of my clients in the end, when they have to choose between India and China, they are going to China. There's a lot of curiosity generated by, thanks to the visit of the Indian Prime Minister to France and in Europe. So they're always afraid about India, whether it is due to the Vodafone tax issue, reforms, and other hurdles being in India. So this is the feedback I wanted to give it to you, and your remarks on that. Rest of the thing I would not like to elaborate.
I think.
Thank you.
I think the Vodafone tax decision, I always believed was an erroneous decision. With the wisdom of hindsight, I have no hesitation in saying that it should never have been taken. And therefore, one of the first decisions that I took was that this government will not bring any retrospective legislation. So this time also, when I did make some changes in the long-term capital gain, till the moment I announced the decision, I said everything which has come in so far will be grandfathered, so that there is no retrospective impact of this. I have tried various methods of in-court, out-of-court, statutory settlement proposals, even as far as those kinds of cases are concerned, and lived up to the assurance that India will never go in for a retrospective tax legislation of this kind. Though conceptually retrospective tax legislations are possible only to validate certain collections which have already been made if a court interferes and strikes it down. That's the only rare exception which takes place. But I think the Vodafone fear is much over. That's a stray case. And if somebody still uses Vodafone as a reason, I think he has some other good reasons for investing elsewhere.
Yeah, I think I've been asked to cut the session short, so maybe one last question from, yeah, sure.
Actually, I, I represent the auto component industry. I'm representing ACMA. You talked about the central and state federalism, the cooperativeness and the upside of it. You talked in the area of education, health and also in the electricity, electrification. I would like to have your take on the transportation, especially transportation safety, where we have roughly 400 Indians dying every day, and there is a GDP loss because of that economic loss. What are we doing? We had a road safety bill which was having this whole cooperative structure coming up, and we lack enforcement to the, to the extent that we are not encouraged to put our money into the safety topic. So where, my question is only on that, are we having something in that direction?
About the road safety bill?
Yes.
Is your question about the road safety bill?
No, not road safety bill, but how the state and center relationship is working in terms of if we have a money in this kitty, we can give it to the state for enforcement to work.
So enforcement to work, and what is the issue?
Today it is lack of the money in the enforcement. We have lack of people every 60.
I don't think, let's be very clear, I'll answer. You see, I don't think there's an issue of lack of resources as far as the states are concerned. I think after the last Finance Commission, the 14th, the states have been very well taken care of. So if, for instance, the states collect what the states collect, the states get, I've always believed, of the GST revenue, in one way or the other, 80% of it goes to the states. Let's be clear. It's my responsibility to steer it, but 50% of GST goes to the states. Of my 50%, 42% by devolution goes to the states. That makes it 71 for the state. And then from the balance I have through central sector scheme, another 8-9% goes to the states. So they get 80 and I keep 20. So states, plus states collect what they collect. And then from the income tax also they get 42%. So the states have a fair amount of resource, and the states have to decide whether that resource is to be used for development, poverty alleviation, or all these things. Or is it only to be used for some kind of populism in distributing some free benefits to people? That depends on what state to state they do. But adequacy of resource in the states is not an issue today.
Thank you. Can we lead from the center? That was my question. Thanks.
Yeah, sure. Okay. Okay, thank you so much. I think we'll just have to we'll have to now end the session. Thank you, sir, for a very wide-ranging and interesting address.
Thank you so much, Mr. Finance Minister. Thank you, Bodhi. Ladies and gentlemen,